The next person everyone in here has heard of. He is a legend in fiscal policy. He is a legend in political rhetoric tactics. The next person is the man behind Americans for Tax Reform. And I will say that while on paper he is impressive because of what he does, because of what he fights for, because he's been published in all of the literature, he's been featured on all of the networks, I will also say that from human to human, he's also kind and humble and intellectually honest, which are some of the best values that we can contribute to politics. So I would like to now introduce my friend, Grover Norquist. Everyone give a warm applause for Grover. And he goes to Burning Man every year, and if that's not good enough reason to like the guy, then I don't know what is. Thank you, Grover.
I was told to give a shout out to the now 500 people who are joining us online. Karl Marx once said that philosophers have tried to interpret the world, but the point is to change it. And I would argue that libertarians who've done a very good job of talking about what the future could be, of why liberty works in theory, of where there are examples of people being more free, doing better when it's less free, and that's the direction we should move in, that we need to spend more time on the business of getting from here to there. So I want to talk about political organizing, specifically from a libertarian perspective. A lot of books have been written by union organizers or by folks who do political organizing on the right or the left. My favorite citizen is a self-employed homeschooler who has a 401k and a concealed carry permit, because that person doesn't ask anything from the government. That person doesn't want anything to the government. And it's very easy to convince that person he should work with you on the next libertarian project because they get it. And what I want to argue is, while there are probably millions of Americans who fall into that category, they're not enough to carry significant numbers of electoral votes. They're not enough to win the House, not enough to win the Senate. But the difference is, if you use the word or instead of and, I would argue that we can build and have built a majoritarian case for a free society. So instead of saying you have to be concerned about the Second Amendment and your 401k, meaning the value of stocks and bonds and health of the economy, and homeschooling, and self-employment, you say or. Because I would argue that the key issues that move votes are the ones that move votes. And for any one person, they may have 21 things. You ask somebody questions on those polls, and you ask questions about, what do you think about this, and they give you a list of 20, but there's one answer in there that moves their vote. And what for homeschoolers, it's often that they're a homeschooler, and then they have lots of other thoughts as well. And if we identify which are the vote-moving issues, I think libertarians will find that you can put together a very significant majority in this country of people who will be with you on moving towards liberty. Not that they've signed off on some 20-point manifesto, but rather that on the issues before them, the one that moves their vote, okay? Not the one they talk about, not the one that gets discussed on talk radio necessarily, but the one that moves their vote. So if you think of who is the potential audience for moving in a libertarian pro-freedom movement, I'd go, and you would put them around the room. Homeschoolers. There's somewhere, we used to say there are 3 million homeschoolers. Now I'm not quite sure what that number is, but it's evidently 2 or 3 times higher than that, thanks to COVID and the incompetence of the public school system in the last 2 years. And now all sorts of other things that the public schools are thinking of doing to or for us and children. But there are at least 3 million homeschoolers, maybe double that, and then the number that's growing. And that is it's a lifestyle issue. If you've met somebody who's a homeschooler, they're a homeschooler very quickly in the conversation, and it moves their vote. You don't have to convince them on the importance of free trade with Singapore. You don't have to convince them about immigration reform. You've got their vote, one fish, one hook, for somebody who says, we will protect your right to be a homeschooler. And you may think, well, isn't that obvious? 40 years ago, in 48 states, it was a crime to homeschool because you were contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The child was not going to school, and the law, except in 2 states, said they have to go to a government-run school. So not too long ago, people in the homeschooling movement would have gone to prison, and did in our lifetimes. Add to that concealed carry weapons. People have permits for concealed carry. That was, again, it wasn't until 1986 that the first state that had stoplights actually passed a concealed carry shall issue law, Florida. There were some square states out west that had done that, but in terms of significant larger states, now it's 44 states have passed shall issue concealed carry. And for people who've made the very significant position to go get that permit and carry a gun with them, they have a very personal relationship with their firearm. I like hunters fine. I was on the board of the NRA, National Rifle Association, for 18 years, and hunters are an important part of the coalition of people who care about the Second Amendment. But hunters tend to keep their weapon locked up in the basement, and a couple of weekends a year they annoy Bambi's relatives. And while guns are important to them, someone who has a personal relationship with their firearm is the person who carries it in their car, in their purse, in the small of their back. That is a person who, when you say to them, we want to protect your right to protect your family, to protect yourself, says, that is, for me, a vote-moving issue. Not every gun owner, but a great number of gun owners are move their votes on that issue alone. So as you look and say, instead of saying, to work with me, I want you to say you are good on gun freedom and homeschooling and self-employment and the gig economy and all the various issues, the words or. And when you find someone who says that is my vote-moving issue, or they start getting animated and talking to you about it, or they bring the subject up first, letting you know it's their vote-moving issue, you don't continue to talk to them about 10 other issues. You engage them in whatever the campaign is, whether it's electing someone or an initiative or getting involved in political work in general. We can and have been building a coalition that is much more freedom-friendly than the 2 political parties have offered in the past. And I'm not suggesting everyone's going to join the Libertarian Party. I think they'll work within necessarily the parties they're for, but vote for the candidate who has the more collection of freedoms. Charter schools. It's a baby step away from public schools with 3 million people. Charter schools were illegal 30, 40 years ago in almost every state. They're a new thing that was created. 3 million people are there, and the Biden administration has said their goal is to shut them down. People take that very seriously, and people can be animated, and if you put the time and effort to get your kid into a charter school, it is likely to be a key voting issue for you. One of the things I discovered recently was vaping. Not discovered the issue, the concept of vaping, but the fact that it is a vote-moving issue for about 13 million adults. Again, vaping didn't exist 20 years ago. Now it's an alternative to smoking cigarettes, and the government, the FDA, wants to shut them down. Bloomberg is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to ban vaping because, follow the logic, vaping is 98% less problematic for you, better for you than smoking cigarettes. So you think harm reduction would be an argument for that. But he thinks that the reason people have stopped smoking so much is that we made it appear tacky, and vaping kind of looks like smoking. And therefore, if people vape, cherry and vanilla and so on, enough of them, and they'll all switch back to smoking tobacco rather than vaping for some reason. Anyway, it's, collect all the underwear, get $1 million. I mean, the logic, there's a leap of logic there that's kind of missing, but they do believe that you should be against vaping for the same reason that the Baptists used to not like dancing, is that not dancing isn't sex, but it looks like sex, and vaping isn't smoking tobacco, but it looks like it, and therefore must be opposed. There are 13 million Americans who vape, who find that reasoning offensive, stupid, not terribly reasonable. And a senator, U.S. senator, was elected on the vaping vote in Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. They organized every vape store. And what happened was on election day, people had been to every one of those vape stores, knew that Ron Johnson was the senator who was saving vaping from the FDA. and he won. He ran ahead of Trump in the state and won his race, and said on television, "I was elected with the vaping vote." So again, as we put together those issues that are key to given constituencies, you don't need a collection of people, 51% of the population, that agree on 12 points. You need 51+% of the population going into election that is voting for the candidate who will leave them alone on their issue, and somebody else is voting because they'll be left alone on a different issue, and you add those up and put them together. I remember early on up in Massachusetts and other states, people who opposed helmet laws were a vote-moving constituency. Not a lot, but it's a number that was not negligible and important. Self-employed people, people in the gig economy, Uber drivers. This administration wants to shut down self-employment, Uber drivers, the whole idea of the gig economy, independent contractor law, to change it to where 10 million plus people would not be able to organize their life the way they want to. They talk to an Uber driver, a Lyft driver, they know that their job and their flexibility is on the chopping block. Remember, that was put on the ballot in California, and California voted no, do not take away the right of people to be independent contractors. Legislature cheerfully took that right away. People went to the polls with an initiative to take it back. Self-employment in the same category. Now, the other team, so if you go around the table, you can get a majority of Americans who, I didn't even get to the people for whom the most important thing is practicing their faith and transmitting it to their kids, freedom of religion. They want to be left alone. They're not asking for Baptist stamps. They just want to be left alone. The gun owners are not asking, they don't knock on your door on Saturday and say, you should come out and go hunting. They just want to be left alone. They don't hand out books entitled Heather Has Two Hunters and make you read them. They simply wish to be left alone with their Second Amendment rights. And that's why you can have in our coalition somebody who wants to go to church all day, who looks across the table at the guy who wants to make money all day and says, that's not how I spend my time. And they both look over at the guy who wants to fondle his guns all day and says, that's not how we spend our time. It's not important that a freedom movement agrees how we're going to spend our time, but that we all agree that we want to elect a persons who will leave all of us alone and leave me alone and you alone. And I care about your issue in the sense that I may not care about it, but I'm glad my candidate's with you because that means more votes for the guy I want elected, who happens to be the same person. On the left, we have a takings coalition. I don't know, left is the wrong word. There's a freedom coalition. There's a takings coalition, the coalition of people who view the proper role of government as taking things from some people and giving it to other people, usually them, usually money. But that's the counter to a leave us alone coalition. And on the takings coalition, you've got the trial lawyers who want to be able to sue everybody, the labor union leadership who wants to be able to collect everyone's dues, the government workers that at the federal level are paid twice what people in the private sector make, the two wings of the welfare issue, people who are dependent on welfare and the people who get $90,000 a year, managing the dependency of others, making sure they don't get a job and get off welfare and stop voting for them. And then all the coercive utopians who are better than you and me, and they know how to run our lives, and they invented and mandate the toilets that don't flush completely and the light bulbs that convince you have glaucoma. And on the Sabbath, you have to separate the green glass from the white glass from the brown glass for the recycling priests. And they have a list of things that you have to do or can't do that is slightly longer and more tedious than Leviticus. And it goes on and on and on about how you should structure your life. And we've made a list of things on that. So again, those two competing structures, one, people who want to use the government to do things to and with other people, and those who on their vote moving issue. Again, there are some people that are very good on the Second Amendment who have what I view as rather odd views on free trade with China. But as long as they're voting on the Second Amendment, they're in our coalition. You do not need to go and browbeat that person and explain to them comparative advantage and not quit talking to them until they understand economics. We can build a coalition where not everybody is a full-fledged libertarian, but at the end of the day, the candidate that they work with, the candidates that they work with, and the parties will start gravitating towards a majoritarian position, which is put forward that way. As we talk about organizing, a couple of other thoughts. whining is not work. People who talk to you and whine that the world is not perfect yet, that somebody had sent Bush a letter and he hasn't done it all yet. Whining is not work. It is a waste of time. And the other is we Americans for Tax Reform, the group that I organizes a meeting in D.C. About 100 people sit in a room every Wednesday for an hour and a half, and 25 people present for 3 minutes. And I recommend to you some outlines of when you're going to have a political meeting and you're going to talk to people. Our meeting and the 44 state similar meetings, you talk for 3 minutes, period. You have more to say, write it down, hand it out. Do not take up everybody's time. 3 minutes. And 2, you talk about the future, not the past, not how everything's gone wrong since the Reformation or whatever the turning point was in your view when things started to go into decline. And lastly, what are you doing about it? We have all the time in the world, or at least all of 3 minutes, to listen to you talk about what you're doing about something in the future and getting things done. And it may not be the project I'm working on, but it's important to me to know what the other people moving towards freedom in their zone are working on, because maybe we can collaborate. One of my favorites is the gentleman who was organizing the legalization of hemp, showed up with his hemp tie and his hemp briefcase a number of years ago and said, we're going to legalize hemp, which was illegal. And then he would come by every few months and say, well, we just did this in this state. And then at the end of the day, Mitch McConnell, the Republican Speaker of the House, has just decided to co-sponsor our bill, or to be the lead sponsor. And at the end of the day, after a few years, hemp was legalized, and now you don't go to jail for having hemp anymore. Small victory, but an important victory to him and to people focused on hemp. And it was somebody else's focus. No, you should drop what you're doing and love and are competent at, and become a private in my army over here to reduce the capital gains tax. People that are fighting for the zone in their life on liberty that matters to them, that they understand, are exactly where they need to be. When they win, or you could ask them on Saturdays to help you on your project, or you could work together, but we should never belittle or underestimate the small platoons of activists that are working on things. Oh, that's not the big picture. I have the big picture here. There isn't one big picture. There are lots of fights for liberty, and lots of areas we can lose, lots of areas we can do better at. And so I'd argue, as we move forward, constantly be looking for new allies. And we discovered the vaping issue because one of our activists was out and said, there's this rally about vaping, whatever that is, tomorrow. It sounds like a big deal. Should I stay? And the answer was yes. And discovered that going to a vapor rally is talking to a bunch of people who care deeply about liberty and protecting their own lives and making their own decisions. And they might as well be small L libertarians on that issue. And that moves them on other issues to better understanding. And you can either ignore it and think that's just one product, or you could recognize that what moves people is desire for self-control, for bettering themselves, and the government's getting in the way. The government says, you're trying to save your life and we want to ban the product that's doing that. Imagine the energy that gives 13 million people, okay? They feel virtuous about what they're doing. They want to do this. And the government says, we'd rather have you die of cancer. That's a motivating factor to say, just leave us alone in this zone and others. The other thing we need to do as we talk about liberties, realize you're talking to everybody at once. Sometimes people think if you're talking just to a gun group, you can talk about guns, but in life, you're never just talking to one group. You need to be able to speak to the freedom issues in a larger group and touch on them all, but also not necessarily go down the road so far that you scare, frighten, confuse people who don't know and follow each of those issues. So understand that a lot of the times you'll be talking to some people in the room, know exactly what you're talking about on the vaping issue or the tax issue or capital gains. But if you start drilling down too far for everybody else, they can get confused. Talk to them separately, offline on that issue. And the other is that everything we do is going to be in coalitions. Okay, libertarians, whatever percentage of the population we are, are not 51%. And so if we're going to win, we need to work with other people who have flawed understandings of the world, okay, on important issues. If they have a correct understanding of the one issue that is nearest and dearest to them, you are so far down the road on getting their help and being able to work with them. And you can, over time, chat with them about, you should be allowed to do what you want to do with your own life. What about the guy over there who has odd views about how to run his life, unlike yours? He wants to be left alone too. And it is amazing, I found, how people recognize when they see the fears that they have or the hopes that they have with getting government to leave them alone. They recognize that other people who maybe I read in the newspaper, those guys are no good. Well, yeah, but they say the same thing about you in your fight for liberty in the zone you're focused on. So constantly looking for coalitions, and we win with a coalition of people who care about lower taxes and homeschooling and religious liberty and being able to start a small business and being able to be self-employed. If you do you do the Venn diagram, and there's a little piece in the middle where the guy understands the Second Amendment and vaping and whether vaccines should be mandated and all these other things. And there's a small group in the middle of 20 circles in your Venn diagram of people who get the and right every single time. Those are the members of the Libertarian Party, okay? And if you're planning on taking over by grabbing the airports and the radio stations, that might work. But if we're going to win elections, you really need the or part, because this spot on the map with the or, which has all of these large and small circles together with a little overlap, the amount of the electorate covered by them, if you say, you're with us if you want your Second Amendment rights, or your First Amendment rights, or your ability, your property rights, or to be left alone on taxes. You add the ors together, then you've got a much larger coalition, one that can win elections and move us forward. A couple of thoughts. When people talk about coalitions, they often talk about bipartisan compromise, which I think is, first of all, since there are at least three parties, but what they mean is bipartisan compromise is beloved in Washington, D.C. by the establishment, because that's how we got to the present mess. The conservatives had some stupid spending ideas and the liberals had stupid spending ideas, and each one thought the others were destructive, so they decided to pass theirs and the others. So now you have a large collection of stupid spending ideas, half of which the conservatives go, oh, we weren't for half of that stuff, and the liberals go, we weren't for half of that stuff, and the taxpayers are paying for all of that stuff, and that's their idea of bipartisan compromise. Or when Nixon wanted the government to get somewhat bigger and Ted Kennedy wanted the government to get much bigger, they would compromise between bigger and somewhat bigger, which was sort of bigger. And if you do that 20 times in a row, you've got to be pretty large. So because the compromise was always how much, but Nixon didn't let them go as far as Kennedy went. And Kennedy would say to his team, I was thwarted and I didn't get to go as far as I wanted. But at the end of the day, if you play that game 20 times, you keep moving towards bigger and bigger government. Good compromise, principled compromise, is when you agree to move more slowly towards your goal of liberty than you had wanted to. So I want to go to Japan from Boston, and if I only get to Missouri, that's not treason. Missouri is on the way to Japan from Boston, okay? But if on your road from Boston to Japan, your feet are wet and everyone's speaking French, you've been moving in the wrong direction, and that's called losing, okay? So if you want limited government and you just compromised on slightly bigger government, that is not a compromise. That is losing, okay? Even nicking government a little, that's hardly worthwhile. It's at least not losing. There's a big difference between moving in the wrong direction and moving however fast, and the right direction slower than you'd like, not as quickly as you'd like to. And so we've actually had some very good left-right coalitions on term limits, where Ralph Nader and I agreed we should both have term limits. I thought I'd get more pro-freedom people elected if they cycled out more. He thought everyone would want more socialists if they cycled out more. And to give you some idea of where the establishment is in Washington, D.C., 2 weeks before the election in 1992, when I think it was 15 states passed, 12 states passed term limits with an average vote of over 77% in each of those states. No state defeated term limits on popular vote. We held a press conference, and not a single Washington press agency showed up to cover that. And after we won everything, the New York Times 10 days later wrote a story in the bomber pages, B11, okay, which talked about what had just happened. So the left, the establishment, not the left, Ralph Nader is quite left, the establishment that's happy with the status quo wanted nothing to do with term limits, and yet it passed with 77% support average across the country in the various states, with support from people who thought of themselves as liberals, conservatives, left, right, socialists, not. Transparency, again, another issue I worked with Ralph Nader on. Ralph Nader thinks if everybody saw how the federal government spent their money more clearly, they'd say, let's do more of this. And I'm pretty sure if everybody saw how the federal or the state or local government spent their money, they'd be a little slower on the draw to join up with some new spending program, and more open perhaps to spend less on what they are doing. But again, nobody gave up on principles. Ralph Nader didn't agree to anything in working with me on transparency he didn't want to do. Ditto with me. I didn't say, oh, Ralph, you've got a really stupid idea there, but we'll stick it in with my good idea and we'll call it a compromise. Neither of us compromised on principle. We'd have passed a bill differently or written it differently if we were the sole owner of it and could make somebody eat it. But in order to build a coalition, we worked. You saw this on criminal justice reform. Criminal justice reform, we had all sorts of odd duck people in the room in terms of where you think they'd be politically. But on the idea of civil asset forfeiture, that perhaps the government shouldn't come and take your car and your money without a conviction, without even charging you with a crime, but because they think it might be with a crime. And then if they take $2,000 in your cash, are you really going to hire a lawyer for $3,000 or $4,000 to get your $2,000 back? Perhaps not. If you went to public school to learn your math, maybe. But you have a real problem there. And Washington Post did a very good article pointing out that more money 2 years ago was taken by police than burglars in the United States in the previous year, about between $3 and $4 billion. So this is not something that's a small number, but you can get a very good left-right. ACLU is very good on stopping civil asset forfeiture. All the center-right property rights groups, limited government groups are very good on civil asset forfeiture. And again, nobody compromised, nobody supported a bill that they weren't happy with. Each of us might have wanted other things in the bill, but that's a different question entirely than something that you didn't want. As you do politics, a couple of last thoughts as I'm coming up on time. Bifocal vision. Bifocals are the things they give you so you can see properly long distance and also right in front of you, okay? Because your cornea or whatever it is doesn't move around as much as it used to. And when we do politics, we always need to have bifocal vision. You need to keep an eye on your feet so you don't trip, okay? Near vision. And you also need to make sure you're heading in the right direction long term. You don't, if you spend so much time looking down at today's fight, you can get turned around and be going in the wrong distance longer. So are we heading in the right direction? Check. Am I tripping? Check. And make sure that you haven't drifted from your goal, and also make sure that in focusing on your wonderful goal, you don't step on a pothole. You don't make a mistake right in front of you that's going to make it difficult to keep going towards the other. Focus on the here and now and long distance. What's the vision of where we're going? What are we trying to do? How do we get there today? And never get frustrated or mad that we seem to be taking baby steps right now if you're moving in the right direction. And certainly don't get excited about taking long strides if you're moving in the wrong direction. You need to constantly, again, do those two things. And let me leave with two thoughts. One is, I've heard a lot of politicians go, you know what? Politicians, good, pro-freedom people who get frustrated that we elect somebody to office who said he was going to be good on everything, and he has a weak backbone, okay? I wish we'd elect more people with good backbones. Here's the problem. You can't see the backbone. It's inside, okay? People have endoskeletons. Mammals have endoskeletons, skeletons inside. You have no idea under pressure what's going to happen to this politician mammal that you sent there because you can't see the backbone. What you need is an exoskeleton. That's what clams are and all the shellfish, right? The skeleton's on the outside. The inside of a clam's not terribly interesting. I mean, it's not, but the outside is strong. And when you go down further into the water, the clam can go down further and the lobsters can go down further than people, because people get crushed by the pressure. But if you have an exoskeleton, you don't get crushed. We are the exoskeleton for the idiots, for our heroes that we elect into office. We hear them promise that they'll be good on this stuff, but politically, what keeps them strong, which keeps them moving in the right direction, is constantly hearing from the people who helped elect them, and then keep, not just, I'll get you next time, but constantly encouraging them, talking to them. Be that exoskeleton, because the pressure in every state legislature and in Congress is they're going to meet 20 people who want them to steal your stuff and give it to somebody else, for every one person from back home who writes and says, hi, have a nice day, vote no, don't steal stuff, okay? They just don't hear regularly. And the exoskeleton are all of the structures and organizations in all our communities that remind them, you know what we want you to do? Leave us alone. We want you to leave us alone. Don't be adding to our burdens in life. Let's get those and make them a little less horrific. And while you can't convince everybody to join you, not everybody can come and join on you. Sometimes you'll run into people who really are just the other team, and them you want to introduce to cocaine or golf, which are two ways to take up a great deal of their time and money when they're not fighting us. But be polite and cheerful, and spend your time being part of the exoskeleton for both candidates, elected officials, and appointed guys, to remind them of where we hope that they will stay when they ran promising to be pro-freedom on the issues that we talked about. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Freedom's worth fighting for.